question of the day. Royal and the other agents of conversion. It's certainly a challenge for the speakers to keep us listening and edify us at this time of the day. I'm sure they'll stand up to this challenge. Sorry, okay. So I won't tell a joke, but I would like to tell an anecdote regarding royal and other agents of conversion, and from the wondrous tales of the Bektashi dervishes, the dervishes that were active from the mid-13th century. And the protagonist is a disciple of the founder, or supposedly the founder of the Bektashi order, Jan Baba, who was sent to to the Mongol Khan to convert him to Islam. And once he arrived at the Mongol Khan's court, he was immediately thrown into a big pot and boiled for 3 days. But he walked out unharmed. And the next ordeal was a fire. He was about to be thrown into the open fire, and then he suggested that the senior shaman of the Mongol Khan would enter the fire with him, and the one who comes out of this ordeal will prove the truth of his religion. So the two are thrown into the open fire, and after 3 days, our protagonist walks out unharmed with the shriveled finger of the shaman in his hands. And he says, had the man entrusted his heart instead of his finger in my hand, his fate would have been altogether different. And if this still hadn't convinced the Khan to convert to Islam, Jan Baba's survival of a poisoning attempt finally did. Okay, so from the distant court of the Asian steppes, we will go back to Europe. Our first lecture is John Tolan's. John works on the history of religious and cultural relations between the Arab and Latin worlds in the Middle Ages. He studied at Yale, the University of Chicago, the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. And is currently professor of history at the University of Nantes and director of the Maison des Sciences de l'Homme en Guerre. And a director of a major project, also funded by European money, the ERC, Remlin, the legal status of religious minorities in the Euro-Mediterranean world, 5th to 15th centuries. He's an author of 4 books mainly on Christian-Muslim relations, a book about Petrus Alfonsi, and a book about Saint Francis. And we're about to hear him speaking about royal policy and conversion of Jews to Christianity in 13th century Europe.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I want to start by, again, ritually, but not just ritually, sincerely thanking the center, and particularly Chaim, for the invitation. And it's a pleasure to be here, even if I'm a little bit angry with Chaim because he didn't warn me that I should prepare a conversion joke, which I have not. And it's particularly difficult to follow up Irvin, whose whole talk was basically an anthology of conversion jokes. But I do have a rabbi joke, which is at least the advantage of being brief. Some of you probably know it. It's from Woody Allen, who says that when he was a young man, he went to see his rabbi and said, look, there's something I've got to ask you. And the rabbi said, no problem. What's bothering you? Tell me. And Woody Allen says, well, why is it that whenever you ask a question to a rabbi, he responds with another question? The rabbi thinks for a minute and says, what's wrong with the question? And today, I'm afraid of leaving you in the situation of Woody Allen. I'm going to leave more with questions. I have more questions to offer you than answers as I talk of royal policy and conversion to Jews and Christianity in 13th century Europe. In particular, I'll be focusing on the Crown of Aragon and the Kingdom of England in the 13th century. And then Jessica Elliott will be speaking to us on the Kingdom of France and royal policy in France. And then Kati Ihnat will be no doubt wanting to one-up us, or perhaps wanting to move things at a higher plane. She'll be talking about the royal policy of the Queen of Heaven. And perhaps, I'm not sure that the Queen of Heaven was much more efficient in converting Jews to Christianity than were these 13th century European kings, if that was indeed their goal. And that's going to be one of the questions that I'm going to ask here today, is in looking at royal policy concerning Jews and regulating their possible conversion to Christianity. We'll see that it was subject to a number of strong and conflicting pressures in 13th century Europe. Church policy, as expressed in increasingly frequent papal bulls and conciliar canons, was to restrict contact between Jews and Christians. Prohibiting Jews, for example, from having Christian servants, making them wear distinctive clothing, limiting the rate of interest they could charge in loans to Christians, etc., etc. At the same time, popes and councils took measures to facilitate and encourage Jews and Muslims to convert to Christianity, allowing Christian preachers access to them and protecting the well-being and property of converts. European kings responded in diverse manners to these pressures from popes, bishops, and councils, at times embracing them, at other times seeing them as a threat to their own lordship over Jews, at times undermining them in their own financial interest. I want to look today at two different strategies towards converting Jews and towards the place of converts in Christian society. Those of two of the longest ruling kings in 13th century Europe, Henry III of England, who ruled from 1216 to 1272, and Jaume I, also known as Jaime or James I of Aragon, who ruled from 1213 to 1276. As we'll see, Henry vigorously asserts lordship over his Jews, and through regular fines and exceptional tallages, makes Jewish money lending into an important source of royal finance and a key factor in the transfer of land from the lower knighthood to the baronial elite. I won't have time to explore all these issues, but they're an important background. In order to protect and maintain his monopoly of power, he prohibits Jews from leaving England and confiscates the property of converts from Judaism. He nevertheless founds in 1232 a royal-funded Domus Conversorum, as we'll see, to house and feed converts from Judaism. This foundation has been seen by some historians as either an expression of his piety or as a meaningless sop to clerical sentiment. Jaume I passed laws obliging Jews and Muslims to listen to mendicant sermons and took measures to protect converts and their property. These two examples will illustrate the complexity and ambivalence of medieval royal attitudes and policies concerning conversion from Judaism to Christianity. So while much has been written about Jewish-Christian relations in the 13th century in England and the Crown of Aragon, I'll try to keep my focus relatively narrow on royal policy towards Jews and in particular towards potential Jewish conversion to Islam. Let me start. I want to first look at the Crown of Aragon under Jaume I, and then I'll look at England under Henry III. My work on England is part of a book project I'm starting on the Jews and Christian society under the reign of Henry III in England. The material on the Crown of Aragon has been worked on quite a bit. Nothing that I'll say is particularly new. There's been a lot of work in Catalan, in French, in English. I might cite a recent article from 2011, Christian Kings and Jewish Conversion in the Crown of Aragon, which is a good place to find recent bibliography. I also cite it out of, because the author is sitting here looking at me and keeping me honest, this is Paula Tartakov. So what I'm saying is nothing particularly new. I just want to look quickly at some of the key legislation, church and royal legislation in Aragon, in the Crown of Aragon under Jaume I. On March 12, 1243, King Jaume presided over the Ecclesiastical Council of Lerida. Among the subjects addressed by the council was the conversion of Muslim and Jewish subjects of the Crown of Aragon. The council issued detailed statutes on the property and inheritance rights of converts from Judaism and Islam. It also fixed fines for anyone who insulted converts. Finally, it proclaimed that, quote, whenever an archbishop, bishop, or Dominican or Franciscan friar comes to town or to a place where Saracens or Jews lives and wishes to proffer the word of God to these same Jews or Saracens, the latter should come when convoked and should patiently listen to their preaching. And if they should be unwilling, our officials should compel them to do so and should accept no excuses. Now the council mentions, as we've seen, archbishop, bishops, etc., but no doubt this measure was adopted at the urging of Raymond de Peñafort, former Master General of the Dominican Order, and at the time confessor and advisor to the king. It corresponds to the evolving Dominican strategy of mission towards Jews and Muslims in Catalonia and more broadly in the Crown of Aragon under Raymond's leadership. On this same day, March 12, 1243, the king took another important measure to facilitate conversion of Jews to Christianity. Whoever, Jew or Saracen, he proclaims, inspired by the grace of the Holy Spirit, should wish to receive the Orthodox faith and obtain the cleansing waters of baptism, he may do so freely and without opposition, regardless of any statute proclaimed by our predecessors or by anyone else, a prohibition, a pact, or custom. In this way, he shall give up nothing of what he has of his goods, be they land, movable goods, or livestock and slaves that he previously held. On the contrary, he shall have them securely, retain them, and possess them on our authority, except for the rights of the children and other legal relatives of the convert, so that the children and the close relatives of the said convert may claim nothing of him while he is alive, but after his death they may demand only that which they would have had a right to claim if he had died in Judaism or paganism. Now these same points are confirmed by a bull that Pope Innocent IV sends to Archbishop of Tarragona 2 years later in 1245, and these same points are reiterated in the Fuero of Aragon, or the Vidal Mayor, compiled by Vidal de Canillas, Bishop of Huesca, a few years later. Jaume ordered this compilation of earlier law, much of it municipal and ecclesiastical, in an attempt to regularize and codify the legal texts and customs of the Kingdom of Aragon. Now the section of the Vidal Mayor dealing with Jews and Saracens opened with a first-person exhortation by Jaume himself, underlining the royal source of the legal authority vested in the text. It takes up the 3 points addressed in the Latter-day Council: inheritance of rights of converts, fines for those who insult them, and the obligation to listen to the sermons of missionary preachers. Then add sections on the inheritance rights of Jews and Muslims, on the rights to buy and sell property, and the problems of runaway Muslim slaves. Now, despite the repeated references to missionary sermons for Jews and Muslims and their obligations to listen to these sermons, there's in fact no real evidence that there was any actual instance of obliging Jews or Muslims to attend such sermons until 20 years later in 1263. And that year, as many of you know, King Jaume, no doubt at the urging of Raymond de Peñafort, ordered Rabbi Moses ben Nachman, or Nachmanides, of Gerona, to publicly debate with Pablo Cristià, a Dominican and a convert from Judaism. Now this is the famous Disputation of Barcelona, which is familiar to many of you here. I won't go into great detail. What's important to emphasize, this Disputation of Barcelona, Nachmanides was forced to do so against his will, and one understands why he'd be reticent to do so, because it's sort of a lose-lose situation. Either he doesn't succeed in debating well enough, and it's a problem for the Jews of Catalonia, or he succeeds at the risk of offending the king in the Christian's presence, which also could cause problems. At any rate, it was anything but an open debate. The whole point was the Dominicans were, through Pablo Cristià, were seeking to show that the Talmud provided proof of the truth of Christianity, and particularly using the Talmud to prove that the Messiah had come. Now we have two very different versions of what happened, a Latin account and Nachmanides' own Hebrew account. As you can imagine, they're quite different in what they show. The Latin account has Pablo Cristia winning points, and Nachmanides is tongue-tied, and Nachmanides' own account has him brilliantly refuting the specious arguments of this stupid Dominican. But they do agree on the main arguments that were followed. But at any rate, what interests me more than the Barcelona disputation itself is what followed. And what followed was a series of texts in which we see the follow-up to this mission, to this dispute, in which Dominicans are going in or attempting to go in and actually preach to Jews and Muslims. And on August 26, 1263, Jaume decreed that all the Jews and Muslims should attend mendicant missionary sermons, and that those who refused to do so would be fined, and converts were to be protected from abuse and harassment. 2 days later, Jaume orders that the books called Sofrim by Maimonides be burned because they contain blasphemies against Christ. The next day, August 29th, Jaume orders the Jews to receive in their homes, in their synagogues, or in other places, Fray Pablo Cristiani, who will preach to them and discuss with them the Holy Scriptures. On the same day, he orders all Jews under his dominion to erase from their writings within 3 months all blasphemies against Jesus Christ or the Holy Virgin that they discover for themselves or that are indicated by Friar Pablo Cristiani. On August 30th, the following day, the king mollifies these decrees, specifying that Jews could neither be forced to leave their neighborhoods to hear sermons, nor be forced to listen against their will. From these documents, and Bob Chazen has looked at these in some detail, it's clear that in the summer of 1263, there was a major initiative in collaboration between the king and the Dominicans to engage with Jews in debate to make them listen to missionary sermons. Clearly, as Chazen has shown, between the 29th and the 30th of August, a considerable lobbying effort on the part of prominent Catalan Jews succeeded in weakening the king's support for Dominican mission and in protecting Jewish interests. Yet in spite of this diplomatic victory, Jews were to be harried in the coming years by Dominicans, convinced that the Barcelona disputation had confirmed that their novel approach could work. Now, I won't go into the details. In the following years, 1264, 1268, some of these ideas are reiterated. There are laws obliging Jews to listen to sermons, but in the same time, then there are laws mollifying these decrees, giving, limiting the number of Christians that can accompany the Dominicans who are going into the Jewish quarters, and so forth, limiting the extent to which Jews have to go outside of their own quarters. So what seems to be, what conclusion we can draw about this monarch's policy toward the conversion of Jews and Christianity is it seems that on the one hand, Jaume is a strong supporter of the Dominicans and their efforts to evangelize Jews and Muslims. He makes Raymond of Peñafort his close advisor. He has legislation passed to oblige Jews and Muslims to listen to missionary sermons, and he makes Nachmanides participate in a public debate with Pablo Cristia. On the other hand, Jews and Muslims are well integrated into society as the Crown of Aragon, and they're able successfully to appeal to the king to have these measures mollified. Both political and financial interests mitigated the king's zeal for the conversion of Jews and Muslims. Now let's move to England. Can one compare the royal policies towards Jews and towards efforts to convert them in these two disparate places? After all, 13th century England, with its small Jewish community, perhaps 5,000 at most at its height, is a very different place from Jaume's realms, with large and thriving Jewish and Muslim communities. Moreover, money lending in 13th century England was almost exclusively done by Jews working under the close supervision of the crown, whereas in the Crown of Aragon, Jews, Christians, and Muslims all participated in money lending with much looser control by the crown. Yet both Henry and Jaume have been portrayed by various historians as keen on the evangelizing of their non-Christian subjects. A number of historians have insisted on Henry's missionary zeal. For Robert Stacey, missions to Jews was close to his heart. For Robin Mundell, quote, Henry III's policy of encouraging conversion was something he took seriously. Yet not all agree. For Robert Dales and Edward King, quote, Henry's policies with regard to Jews are seen to have been essentially contradictory. So I want to look at some of the documents that shed light on the contradictions underlying Henry's policy concerning Jews and their conversion. Now in England as well as in Aragon, it's essential to examine the role of the mendicant orders, particularly the Dominicans. The friars preachers established themselves in England in the 1220s, the same time as they're establishing themselves in the rest of Europe. According to the chronicler Nicolas de Triveti, the first Dominicans arrived in 1221, accompanied by Peter de Roche, Bishop of Windsor, who was coming back from a pilgrimage to Rome. They preach in Canterbury in the presence of Archbishop Stephen of Canterbury, who then, impressed by their sermon, allows them to establish themselves in London, and particularly in Oxford, where they settle, and they're given land in the heart of Oxford, right next to the Jewish quarter. And this is something that's going to be important, of course, in many parts of Europe, including in England. The friars, Dominicans and Franciscans, are often going to be placed closely in the Jewish quarter, or close by the Jewish quarter. It is in their Oxford convent in 1230 that the English Dominicans held their first provincial council, and the situation of the Dominicans in England isn't the same as that of Aragon. There is no Raymond of Penyafort, who's at the heart of the English court, and there are no close ties that I've found so far between the order and the monarch. And this is very much work in progress. I've only begun to look at this question that I have to go into in greater detail. What are the contacts of these friars with the Jewish communities, and to what extent is there missionary sermons, if any, going on? So again, for the time being, more questions than answers on this topic at least. But the cornerstone of the argument for those who portray Henry as keen on proselytizing the Jews is the Domus Conversorum, or House for Converts, which he founded in 1232. In the foundation charter, Henry grants 700 marks to the Domus Conversorum, which is founded in the honor of the Virgin in London on New Street, what's now Chancery Lane, in order to pay for the expenses of the converts and to build a church for their use. It seems that the converts residing in the Domus Conversorum were to live a quasi-monastic life in this convent devoted to the Virgin Mary, with a modest subsistence furnished by the king, though there's no mention, as he quasi-monastic, but there's no mention of vows to be taken, and provisions are made for families of converts. The importance of this foundation for the king is underlined by the social and political prominence of the witnesses that he summoned to Lambeth Palace, the Episcopal Palace in London, to sign the charter. They included the Royal Justiciar Hugh of Berg, Peter of Roche, Bishop of Windsor, Walter Mauclair, the Royal Treasurer, who then becomes the first warden of the Domus. On March 9th, 1232, Henry sends a mandate to Walter Mauclair, ordering that out of the 700 marks per year assigned to the king for the sustenance of the Fratrum Conversorum, that he provision 2 chaplains and food, clothing, and other things necessary for the celebration of the divine office in the chapel in which the king has built for the converts. In the same year and following years, I won't go into all the details, but there are a number of documents in which the king is sending converts to the Domus and ordering Walter, who is the warden, to admit them and to see to their sustenance. We also have a number of documents in which the king and various people close to the king donate land or money to the Domus. So what seems to be happening is there's a rather modest amount of money that's going to the Domus and a steady but rather modest trickle of converts. Now the motivation for this foundation, according to Henry's 1232 charter, is divine inspiration and the concern for the salvation of his own soul and that of his ancestors, particularly his father, King John. The language is echoed in the description that Chronicle Matthew Paris gives of the foundation. He says, for the salvation of his own soul and that of his father, King John, Henry established a church and convent where Jews could live honestly. I cite, Henry III built a decent church fit for a conventual congregation with other buildings adjoining at his own expense in the place where he had established a house for converts for the ransom of his soul and that of his father, King John, and all their ancestors in the 17th year of his reign. That is to say, in London, not far from the old temple. To this house converted Jews retired, leaving their Jewish blindness, and had a home and safe refuge for their whole lives, living under an honorable rule, with sufficient sustenance, without servile work or profits of usury. So it happened that in a short time a large number were collected there. And now, being baptized and instructed in the Christian law, they live a praiseworthy life under a governor specially appointed. And in the margin of the manuscript, Matthew has drawn a picture of the convent, of the church and adjoining convent. The Domus Conversorum is, to my knowledge, unique in 13th century Europe, a royally funded institution devoted wholly to converts from Judaism, providing sustenance for them in a quasi-monastic environment. It's perhaps no wonder that various historians have seen this as proof of Henry's zeal for the conversion of Jews. Yet, it's not clear how effective a tool it was for that goal, if that was indeed the goal. Various documents give the names of the wardens of the Domus. The first, as we've seen, was Walter Mauclair, who had been royal treasurer and bishop of Carlisle. The choice of a prominent member of his entourage no doubt showed that Henry was serious about this, and he wanted to entrust the new institution to someone with power, influence, and access to crown revenues. But it also meant that the new warden probably spent little time at the Domus, occupied as he was with other charges, and occupied also, I might add, with political intrigues. As in the 1230s, he experienced exile, excommunication, and finally reconciliation with the English Church and Crown. Moreover, as various historians have shown, the Domus was chronically underfunded. The various grants of land and money mentioned above did not suffice for the upkeep of the church and lodgings and the living expenses of the converts and personnel. At its height, it probably housed fewer than 100 converts. Granted, these converts were not, if I might say, the only objects of royal neglect. King Henry, known for his extravagant spending and costly and failed European military adventures, often failed to respect his financial engagements. Indeed, an inquiry made at Henry's demand towards the end of his reign indicated the Domus was in a precarious state and serious financial difficulties. The only substantial relief to the financial troubles of the Domus Conversorum was to come much later, on May 26, 1280, through a mandate by Henry's son and successor, Edward I. Edward orders various reforms to better the situation of the Domus and its residents. The attribution of clerks to see the spiritual needs of the converts, the encouragement of the learning of trades by the converts, etc. In particular, Edward takes measures to ensure the financial solvency of the institution and a decent allowance for its inmates. These include the attribution of the Domus, to the Domus of various revenues, and particularly from the chevage or poll tax levied on Jews. But no doubt the most significant measure was the abolishment of the previous royal practice of seizing the possessions of Jews who converted to Christianity. Henceforth, converts would be able to keep half of their goods. The other half would go to the crown, but would specifically be used for the maintenance of converts and the upkeep of the Domus. We've seen that in 1243, Jean I assured that converts from Judaism or Islam would be able to keep all their goods. Almost 40 years later, Edward concedes only half their property to converts, something his father Henry had never done. Indeed, if Henry's foundation of the Domus can be said to represent a modest attempt to convert Jews to Christianity, it must be weighed in the balance against royal fiscal policy. The practice of seizing 100% of your goods, I'm probably not going to convert many of you if I say, please convert, and while you're at it, give me everything you own. So this is not exactly a way to encourage Christianity. On the other hand, repeated heavy and arbitrary taxation of Jews in the form of tallages led a number of Jews to financial ruin in the 13th century, in some cases landed them in prison. Add to this sporadic outbreaks of anti-Jewish violence and increasing pressures from the church to limit Jewish-Christian contacts and to proselytize among Jews. Those Jews who were bankrupt and faced imprisonment as well as those whose families had been decimated through violence, might indeed find a peaceful and modest life of poverty in the Domus to be, if not attractive, at least the least bad option. But this hardly makes Henry into someone who took conversion seriously, who held it close to his heart. On the contrary, I would conclude with Robert Dales and Edward King, I quote, "Upon closer scrutiny, Henry's policies with regard to the Jews are seen to have been essentially contradictory. It's highly dubious on pragmatic grounds that the king would have initiated a wide-ranging program to convert the Jews of England. This foundation of the Domus Conversorum may more reasonably be seen as a matter of necessity on the one hand and defensive Christian mentality on the other, both served by a public act of traditional piety, which at the same time may have eased his conscience. So to conclude, perhaps it will appear that this has been a comparison of apples and oranges. Two very different kings, two very different kingdoms. England with a small Jewish minority that had been present in the island for only a century and a half, and which had always been closely associated with money lending and with royal power. On the other hand, the multiple lands of the crowns of Aragon, Catalonia, Valencia, Mallorca, and Aragon proper, with large and thriving Jewish communities that had been present since antiquity, and which participated in many domains of society and economy. Yet if we keep our focus narrowly on royal policy, we can see how both Jaume and Henry had to struggle with conflicting pressures and interests in defining their policy towards Jews and their potential conversion to Christianity. Of the two, it's no doubt Jaume who took more effective, concrete action to encourage conversion. But both monarchs finally produced policies that were vacillating and contradictory, paying lip service to the notion of conversion and taking some measures to encourage it, but in their own financial interest and in response to pleas from their Jewish communities, subsequently undermining whatever pro-conversion measures they may have taken. So as I say, particularly the second part on England is very much work in progress, and I'll be interested to hear any suggestions. I offer you, perhaps, to conclude, more questions than answer, but on the other hand, what's wrong with the question?
Thank you for two fascinating stories. Our next speaker is Jessica Elliott, who's a recent PhD in medieval history from the University of California, Santa Barbara. The title of her PhD is The Changing Status of Converted Jews in 13th and 14th Century Northern France. She's currently a postdoctoral researcher at Gremlin, the same institution, right? Studying the legal status of religious minorities in the Euro-Mediterranean world from the 5th to the 15th centuries. And she works particularly on 13th and 14th century Latin legal sources concerning Jews in northern France and province.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to present this material here today. I have no jokes. Let's get that out of the way. Today I'm going to discuss royal support for converted Jews in northern France under Philip the Fair and his sons, Louis X, Philip V, and Charles IV, the last kings of the direct Capetian dynasty, a period that lasted between 1285 and 1328. Scholars such as Robert Stacey, Lauren Vogel, and John Tolan have shown that many English converts from this period were destitute, socially marginalized, and dependent on the financial support of the English crown for their very survival. In France, Philip the Fair and his successors also granted pensions to converted Jews, as English kings did, but the number of French converts who received these pensions was quite small. In the first half of the paper, I'll discuss what we can know about converts in northern France based on the evidence of these pensions, as well as the ways in which Philip the Fair did and did not continue policies of his grandfather, Louis IX, St. Louis, that were aimed at encouraging Jews to convert to Christianity. This evidence, taken together, suggests that support for converted Jews was a relatively low priority in northern France in the late 13th and early 14th century. Then, in the second half of the paper, I'll discuss some possible explanations for this apparent lack of royal support for converts, and I will draw on evidence from other contemporary financial sources, primarily tax records from Paris in the 1290s, to suggest that this was due to the overall socio-economic assimilation achieved by French converts as a group through the turn of the 14th century. So I'll begin with French edicts and policies concerning converts. Anti-Jewish legislation took many forms in 12th and 13th century France, although the conversion of French Jews does not appear to have been a priority for the crown until the reign of Louis IX, St. Louis, in the mid-13th century. Louis IX and his successor, Philip III, enacted a number of policies that were aimed, at least in part, at making remaining Jewish so difficult that converting to Christianity became a viable alternative. These measures included mandating participation in disputations, culminating in the burning of many wagon loads of Hebrew books in Paris in the 1240s, multiple royal edicts aimed at limiting Jewish lending, and edicts in 1269 requiring Jews to attend conversionary sermons and to wear a distinctive badge under Louis IX, and the expulsion of Jews from small villages in France in 1276, and the renewed ban on the Talmud in 1283 under Philip III. Some of these policies remained in place under Philip the Fair. In 1288, for example, Philip the Fair confirmed the edict requiring Jews to wear a distinctive badge, which they were actually required to purchase from the crown. French Jews were also subject to heavy taxation, as well as the ransoming of Jewish property by the crown under the last Capetians, as they had been under Philip the Fair's predecessors. However, other practices that were explicitly aimed at conversion, such as conversionary sermons and forced disputations, do not appear to have continued under the last Capetians. Incidentally, there's no evidence that the last Capetians offered tax exemptions to converts, which we know the Angevin branch of the family did in southern Italy in the 1290s. But there's also no evidence that Jews who converted under Philip the Fair were forced to forfeit their property, or a percentage of their property, to the crown, as they were in England and at times elsewhere in medieval Europe, which suggests that those who converted would be much less likely to be impoverished after conversion, as John has so clearly explained for us. And I'll return to this point and what this means in France in the second half of the paper. Like some other monarchs in 13th century Europe, Philip the Fair and other members of the French royal family occasionally became the godparents of converted Jews, a practice for which their ancestor Louis IX had had much enthusiasm. But this happened less frequently in late 13th century France than it did elsewhere or at other times. In fact, French royal accounts identify only one individual, Philippe le Convert, as the godson of Philip the Fair. Another individual is identified as the goddaughter of Philippe's queen, and a third as the goddaughter of their daughter Isabel. There's no other evidence for either of the women, but the career of Philippe le Convert is well documented in financial and judicial sources for the reigns of Philip the Fair and his sons. By the end of his life, Philippe le Convert had amassed a great landed estate and had been ennobled so that he could hold the lands as a noble fief. He had received royal approval to found a hospital for the poor in his native village, approximately 20 miles outside of Paris. He had sat in the Parliament of Paris, revised forest legislation, and advised 4 Capetian kings. He had found lucrative administrative posts for several members of his family, and he'd even seen his sister and her children ennobled as well. Other prominent late 13th century converts, such as Henry of Winchester in England, eventually faced limits to their ability to integrate into Christian society. As Robert Stacey and Paul Brand have shown, in the late 1270s, Henry of Winchester conducted a sting operation against Christians and Jews suspected of coin clipping, after which his testimony could have been given the force of record, meaning that no one would have been able to dispute it. Henry was initially assigned to testify against both Christian and Jewish defendants, until the Bishop of Hereford expressed outrage that a converted Jew might be able to sentence Christians to death based only on his own testimony. Henry's appointment was withdrawn from the crown, and in the end he was only allowed to testify against Jewish defendants. In France, however, Philippe's status as a convert does not appear to have limited his career or his influence at court in any way. But Philippe also does not appear to have succeeded because of his status as a convert. as could have been the case if Philip the Fair were trying to use his support of his godson, Philippe, as a way to bolster his image as a most Christian king, and as a way to model himself after his grandfather, Louis IX. At times, Philippe's personal relationship with the king gave him a professional edge, but it seems to have been based more in having known the king since childhood, rather than in his particular status as a convert. The success achieved by Philippe and his relatives was limited to their family. We don't see any pattern of the French court giving lower level posts to other converts in any large number. And most importantly, Philippe also did not play a role in the formation or imposition of anti-Jewish and conversionary policies, unlike other high-profile medieval converts, such as Nicholas Donin and Pablo Cristiani, who had played a key role in the formation of anti-Jewish initiatives at the court of Louis IX 2 generations earlier. Despite his enthusiastic support for this particular convert, Philip the Fair does not appear to have shared his grandfather's enthusiasm for the conversion of Jews in general, nor does he appear to have been particularly interested in Philippe's status as a converted Jew, or in putting Philippe's status or background to work as part of a royal project of converting other French Jews. So, turning from policies regarding conversion and royal sponsorship of converts at baptism to monetary support for converts during this same period. In France, the first pensions for converted Jews were granted in 1239 during the reign of Louis IX. Several of the converts who received pensions were named Louis, presumably because they had been sponsored by the king at baptism. After Louis returned to France from his first crusade in the 1250s, royal pensions were also dispersed to groups of unnamed individuals identified as baptizati. Historians have generally interpreted these baptizati as Jewish children who had been abandoned or orphaned and baptized by the church. There's less that we can know about these baptizati, since they almost always appear in groups without being identified by name. So my discussion today will focus on the adult and adolescent converts, identified as conversi in royal accounts. We know that financial support for converts continued under Philip IV, Philip the Fair. Approximately 80 French converts, presumably adults or at least adolescents, received pensions over the 43-year period between 1285 and 1328. So this is a total of 80 converts over those 43 years, not 80 converts per year. In some cases, converts appear to have received this pension for life. A small number of pensions were granted to the widows and children of deceased male converts. Generally, these pensions ranged from 2 to 12 deniers per day, with most individuals receiving a pension in the 4 to 6 deniers range. As a point of reference, 4 deniers could buy a day's worth of food in Paris at this point. The amount of an individual's pension never changed, although the amount received by different converts varied, with no clear pattern to explain why a particular convert might have received a smaller or larger amount. By contrast, in London, male converts always received the same set amount, while female converts always received the same, slightly smaller set amount. The only exception came when royal funds couldn't keep up with the number of English converts needing this support, in which case a new male convert might receive the pension of a recently deceased female convert, and in this case the male convert would receive that smaller set amount. This was not the case in France. In France, male converts did not, as a rule, receive more than female converts, nor did a godson or goddaughter of a member of the royal family necessarily receive a larger pension. So it's basically at this point it's unclear why these amounts vary, and especially why, even though amounts between individuals might vary, the same individual receives the exact same amount every time they appear. And even within the same sort of, when these funds are handed out to a group of individuals, you might have one convert who's receiving 4 deniers, and then the next convert is receiving 6 deniers. So it doesn't vary based on sort of how much is being dispersed at that particular moment. So between 1285 and 1314, during the reign of Philip the Fair, fewer than 20 converts drew a pension in any given year. Based on the accounts from which these pensions were drawn, many of the individuals were based in Paris, but others were scattered across northern France. There's a gap in the surviving records for the next few years, but by 1322, the next year for which these accounts survive, the number of converts drawing pensions had jumped to 28. And for the first time, many of the converts who drew pensions were identified as belonging to a family, parents and children, that had converted to Christianity together. In 1322, over half of the converts who appear in the royal accounts belonged to 6 such families. In these cases, each individual drew his or her own pension, but they were dispersed to the family in one lump sum. It's likely that the increase in the number of converts receiving pensions, and especially the shift from individual converts to convert families, reflects a change in the circumstances of conversion, perhaps to avoid expulsion, perhaps in response to growing anti-Jewish sentiment and the threat of violence. Still, the total number of adult or adolescent converts drawing pensions in 1322 is not large, 28. In earlier years, the total number of converts drawing pensions was never more than 20, and often quite a bit smaller. In contrast, Lauren Vogel has shown that in London, the Domus Conversorum alone was home to perhaps 25 to 30 converts during the 1280s, and as many as 80 to 100 converts by 1292. Many of the English converts who lived in the Domus and drew pensions depended on this support to survive. When royal pensions were severely delayed at the beginning of the 14th century, many English converts died as a result. This does not appear to have been the case in France. Only a small number of French converts appear to have received royal pensions, and those who did do not appear to have lived in the same dire circumstances as converts in England. French converts who received royal pensions did not live in a Domus Conversorum, and there's even evidence that some of the converts who received these pensions also worked. So this wasn't, receiving this kind of pension, is it necessarily indicative of being poor and dependent on this support? So the question is, why? Why did fewer French converts draw pensions, and why would royal support have been less crucial for the survival of converts in France? There were many converts in northern France, especially Paris at this time, many more than the number who received royal pensions. So it can't simply be that a large number of converts in England in the 1290s necessitated a more comprehensive royal response. It's possible that the relative lack of royal support of converts could be partially explained by the fragmentary nature of the sources in France. The royal accounts for many years haven't survived, so any statistical analysis of this group would need to be extremely tentative, if not impossible. However, enough converts drew pensions over multiple years that it's reasonable to expect that the lists would have remained relatively stable in the intervening years. As an example, accounts survived for 1299 and 1305, and not for the 5 years in between. But 13 of the 18 converts who drew pensions in 1299 also drew a pension in 1305, making it very likely that those 13 would also appear in the accounts for 1300, 1301, and so on, if they had survived. It's also possible that growing anti-Judaism in France in the late 13th century, the decades leading up to the expulsion of Jews from France in 1306, might have led to greater suspicion of converted Jews, which could perhaps be reflected in a lack of support for converts from all sides. However, I would like to suggest another explanation, that the last Capetians offered much less support for French converts simply because in late 13th and early 14th century northern France, that support was not necessary. Evidence from tax assessments, guild records, and property records suggests that converted Jews were well integrated into multiple sectors of the bourgeois working world in late 13th century Paris. Parisian converts resided and worked throughout the city, and the settlement patterns suggested by tax registers and property records are consistent with those of the Christian community as a whole. The majority of converts resided on the right bank, as did the majority of all artisans and craftsmen in medieval Paris. Few converts lived in close proximity to other converts, but a significant number of them lived near neighbors who practiced related trades or who paid comparable levels of tax. A total of 50 converted Jews appear in the registers of this tax, a tax imposed by Philip the Fair on the bourgeois of Paris in the 1290s. The tax registers record the occupations of slightly more than half of these individuals. Property and guild records identify the occupations of another 6 converts in late 13th century Paris. From these records, we know that converts practiced at least 18 different professions, which fall into 9 broad categories. 6 converts were involved in the hospitality industry, operating establishments such as inns and taverns. 8 were public officials, 6 of whom were charged with maintaining order within the city as sergeants or judges. 7 were involved in various medical professions, ranging from surgeons to spice dealers or apothecaries. In smaller numbers, converts were merchants and stonemasons, and the rest were involved in food production, textiles, and the manufacture of large and small goods. 3 wealthy convert taverners were also identified as practicing other lucrative trades that were unrelated to tavern keeping, spice dealing, and horse trading, which suggests that they were wealthy enough to have cash to invest in other business ventures. Both of these professions, spice dealing and horse trading, were associated with the wealthy alderman families of 13th and 14th century Paris, studied by Boris Bove. Wealthy converts also owned property within the city of Paris and in the surrounding countryside. Owning property, especially rural property, was a significant marker of economic success, since it meant that a person could live off the income from the land or invest the revenues in other business ventures, such as horse trading. In smaller numbers, successful Parisian converts formed associations with prominent bourgeois through participation in Christian guilds and marriage into bourgeois Christian families. 2 converted Jews, for example, were prominent members of the Paris Surgeons Guild in the late 1260s. Guild membership conferred both social and economic benefits and was an important component of urban life, one which was out of reach for Jews. These 2 converts were named to a jury of 6 master surgeons who were charged with conducting examinations to determine who was worthy of practicing the profession in Paris. As members of this jury, they would have been among the most prominent and respected members of their guild. Other converts married into and married their children into well-off bourgeois families. We know from the tax records that the daughters of at least 3 converts appear to have married, to again borrow Paula's term, cradle Christians, one of whom was a draper, a cloth merchant. Drapers were among the most important merchants in medieval Paris, which suggests that this convert's son-in-law was most likely from a wealthy bourgeois family. 6 converts practiced trades that we know were practiced by Jews in 13th century Paris. 5 doctors, a barber, a butcher, and a silk spinner were among the Jews who were taxed in Paris at this time. These professions were also among those practiced by converts. Jews who converted as adolescents or adults had most likely received the necessary professional training prior to their conversion. So the large number of Parisian converts who were involved in various medical professions suggests that Parisian Jews may have been involved in medicine in even greater numbers than the extant sources have indicated, as we know they were in medieval Provence. The participation of converts in the silk industry, along with the participation of the children and associates of other converts in the embroidery and cloth trades, suggests that Jews, and particularly Jewish women, may have played an active role in the Parisian textile industry. Other converts practiced trades, such as tavern keeping, that have not typically been associated with the Jewish community of medieval Paris. It's possible that the existence of Jewish taverners in Paris has been obscured in the surviving sources. It's also possible that Jews who had experience in related fields, such as viticulture, applied their training to new and lucrative occupations after converting. The success that converts found in professions such as tavern keeping, surgery, and spice dealing, fields that required their customers to trust them with their lives, and which were associated with Christian fears about Jewish poisoners, suggests that a significant number of Parisian converts, despite being identified as conversi, were able to disassociate themselves with negative aspects of their former identities in the eyes of their Christian neighbors. In sum, the idea that converts were marginalized and impoverished across medieval Europe does not hold true for 13th century Paris. Converts practiced a broad range of occupations, and they lived and worked in neighborhoods across the city. A smaller number of converts were able to marry into well-off bourgeois families, and to access and even gain leadership positions in Christian trade guilds. At least through the end of the 13th century, the lives of Parisian converts were not necessarily defined by their conversi status. So, to conclude, at first glance, support for converted Jews seems to have been a low priority for Philip the Fair and his sons. At the end of the 13th century, The total number of Parisian converts appears to have been significantly larger than the number of converts in London. A group of 50 converts were liable for this tax suggests a total conversi population of at least 166 to 200 converts in Paris. Yet a much smaller number of Parisian converts received royal pensions. There was no comparable institution to the London Domus Conversorum. One convert, the godson of Philip the Fair, became a high-level royal official, but he wasn't involved in the creation or implementation of any anti-Jewish or conversionary policies. So in this paper, I have asked why there might have been a lack of royal interest in supporting converts in France. Lauren Fogel has shown that royal support for converts dried up in England in the late 13th and early 14th century. And we know that Philip the Fair experienced significant financial difficulties of his own during this period. However, the evidence from tax records from the 1290s, discussed here, suggests another explanation. If fewer converts received royal support in France than in England, it's possible that this is because less support was needed. As I have argued here, in the late 13th century, a significant number of converts were well integrated into multiple sectors of the bourgeois Parisian working world. So this leads to the question, why were converts able to assimilate into the bourgeois Parisian working world more successfully than in England? There are two likely explanations, both related to economic status. First, as John mentioned earlier, there's no evidence that Jews who converted under Philip the Fair were required to forfeit their property to the crown, as they were in England and elsewhere. This suggests that French Jews who converted would have been much less likely to be impoverished after conversion. And it also means that property forfeiture would not have served as a disincentive to conversion for wealthier Jews, who may have been more likely to convert for commercial benefit, such as the possibility of joining Christian trade guilds. Second, it's possible that a wider variety of economic roles were available to French Jews. Although the Jews of northern France were subject to increasingly restrictive anti-Jewish legislation during the second half of the 13th century, their political and economic roles do not appear to have been as narrow as they were in England. And while 13th century French Jews were subject to heavy taxation, they did not face the crushing economic burden that English Jewry experienced in this period. Furthermore, the variety of occupations practiced by converts, particularly those in which converts and their associates appear to have participated in large numbers, suggests that northern French Jews may have also had an active role in those professions, as other historians have shown for Jews in the medieval Mediterranean, in ways that have been largely invisible in the surviving sources. A wider variety of economic options as Jews would have meant an even wider variety of options after conversion, creating a situation in which converted Jews were able not only to survive, but to thrive in 13th century northern France. Thank you.
As I work myself on a time and place that hardly has any archival evidence, I'm really impressed by this both painstaking and creative work with archives. Really interesting. Our third lecturer is by Kati Ihnat, who is currently a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Bristol, studying the religious culture of early medieval Iberia. She completed her PhD on high medieval devotion to the Virgin Mary at Queen Mary, appropriately, University of London in 2011. And she's currently turning her thesis into a monograph. She's taken up 2 postdoctoral fellowships, one at Trinity College Dublin and the second at the University of Pennsylvania. And we will hear from her about converting the Jews through Mary in Visigothic Iberia.
Here, I know it's been a long day with so many ideas. Your brains are probably bursting like mine. But I'd also like to thank the organizers, obviously, for your wonderful hospitality, also for this amazing sunshine. I feel like it's been about 8 months since I've seen it, so this is really wonderful. Now, I'm not going to start with a joke, but something that I really almost wish were a joke. And this is a newspaper clipping. Actually, there was reported less than a month ago that the Spanish government, and more specifically the Interior Minister, gave or awarded a gold medal for policing to a statue of the Virgin Mary in the southern city of Malaga. More specifically, and I'm quoting here from this Guardian article, for sharing police values such as dedication, caring, solidarity, and sacrifice. Now, I was really astonished by this, especially because it struck such a chord with my own research. I'm very interested in the role of the Virgin Mary in medieval culture, where I see her getting this role ascribed to her again and again and again. Now, Mary is a defender of the faith. Not just because, like in this example, she punishes the enemies of Christianity, but because belief in the virgin birth really marks out proper Orthodox believing Christians from those who stand outside of Orthodox Christianity. Also, she has a very important missionary role, so it's up to her to sort of bring people into the faith. And we see her ascribe this role in literature, in theology, even in liturgy, and oftentimes she is pitted against a particular individual, a figure, and that's the Jew. Jews feature as the opponents of Mary in many early Christian sources that argue in favor of the virgin birth and the incarnation. And this is obviously because of the Jews' refusal to accept that God could have entered and been born of the body, from the body of a woman. And so Mary appears often in literature, such as miracle stories, playing a very essential role in getting the Jews to convert. And like in this story of Jacob the Jew of London getting converted by the Virgin Mary, which this illustration is from the big volume of the Cantigas of Santa Maria from 13th century Castile. Moving back in time, quite a few centuries, one such example where we see this exact kind of thing happening is in the Liber de Virginitate of Ildefonsus, who was the Metropolitan Bishop of Toledo between 657 and 667. It's a polemical treatise that defends Mary's perpetual virginity against the figures of two heretics and a group of unnamed Jews. Now, these heretics are called explicitly Jovinian and Helvidius, and this is clearly borrowing from the work of Jerome, the 4th century patristic theologian, and it's possible that this kind of engagement with Jews is also drawing from earlier polemical traditions, such as Jerome's. But before dismissing Jews as they appear in this treatise as merely a hangover from earlier Christian polemics, I think it is worth exploring whether Ildefonsus or his audience in Visigothic Iberia envisioned this treatise being used in real polemics, that is to say, with some desire to address or engage directly with Jews. Now, the reason why this currently rather unfashionable idea even suggests itself is that the treatise became an integral part of the liturgy of one of the most important religious holidays in Visigothic Iberia, and that's to say, the Feast of Mary that is celebrated on the 18th of December. Now, the fact that this treatise was meant to be communicated publicly as part of a religious ritual raises some very interesting questions about its place in 7th century Iberia, particularly in the context of repeated attempts, as we saw this morning with Jesse Sherwood's talk, in this period to convert the Jews en masse, at least according to the legal sources. And I think what we can draw from the session earlier this morning is that we have to exercise extreme caution with dealing with these kinds of normative sources, because it's a genre with a very specific historical trajectory and also with its own rhetorical strategies. So keeping that very firmly in mind, I think I'm going to present first the surviving materials for the study of the Marian liturgy and their relation to this polemical treatise by Ildefonsus of Toledo, to understand how the feast day was designed essentially to provide a message of Mary as the only path to salvation. Secondly, to tackle the question of the legal sources and what they tell us about the reality of Jewish presence and the question of conversion in 7th century Iberia. And finally, to raise some problems that arise from considering the liturgy as a tool for conversion, and finish with a final concession. But we'll start with the liturgy itself. Actually, can you all hear me? I completely forgot to put on the microphone. Good? All right. So, Now, Ildefonsus was not yet even Bishop of Toledo when in 656, at the 10th Council of Toledo, a very important decision about liturgical practice was made. The Feast of the Annunciation, which commemorates the angel Gabriel coming to Mary to essentially tell her that she's going to be the mother of the Messiah, normally celebrated on the 25th of March, this feast often fell, therefore, during Lent, which means that it compromised the ability to celebrate it with all of the pomp that it was thought to deserve. So, at Ildefonsus's insistence, or at least this is the way this narrative is remembered in later sources, and with the ratification of this council, the feast was moved to the 18th of December, which is exactly 1 week before Christmas. Now, this makes sense. Obviously not from a chronologically appropriate perspective, because obviously the 25th of March is exactly 9 months before Christmas. However, it does fit very well thematically, because it's part of the Advent season, when Christ's impending birth is celebrated for those 4 weeks preceding Christmas. So the last week would celebrate him through his mother. Now, we have a number of surviving manuscripts that provide the contents of this liturgy. These are some examples, some of the earliest examples here. Now, you can see that while most of these are from later centuries, so from the 9th and 10th centuries, they are nevertheless an almost perfect match with the late 7th century manuscript, the Verona Orational, which provides us with the earliest surviving example of the liturgy as it was practiced in early medieval Spain. Now, there are two things I think that we can note about this liturgy. First of all, it is incredibly consistent across these sources. Many of these manuscripts are either of uncertain origin or they're of varying origin, so they could be monastic, cathedral, from parish churches, yet their contents for this liturgy are pretty much identical, and this is almost unheard of for this liturgical tradition, where there's generally some kind of variation between practices that indicate different regional traditions. Now, this is all the more striking because this feast is completely unique to Iberia. Nowhere else in Western Europe do they celebrate this Feast of Mary on the 18th of December. And although the Old Hispanic liturgy has many unique elements to it, normally it shares a lot of the feast days with the rest of Western Europe, but this one is completely unique. Now, the second important thing to note about this liturgical practice is that it is long. It is the longest of all of the feast days that are celebrated in the Old Hispanic liturgy. And we can see this most prominently in the office of Matins. This is the office that is celebrated, or the service that is celebrated at midnight. So it's in the middle of the night. They would get up and perform this. It is the longest Matins office by a very long way. Now, it's made even longer because it included very lengthy readings. And what are these readings? They are the entire treatise of Ildefonsus of Toledo. This is a 20,000-word treatise that is being read out in the church. It's divided up into 7 sections, as you can see here. These are chants and there are corresponding prayers. They're repeated 7 times, and each one of them gets about a half-hour reading. Now, with a colleague, actually, we tried to calculate, just by doing a short excerpt of this, how long it would have taken. She was doing some of the singing, because she's a musicologist, and I was doing the reading, and we calculated it would have taken more than 6 hours to do this whole thing. Now, the readings are so long, actually, that they're not included in the liturgical manuscripts themselves. So they're not included with the chant texts and the music. They're actually found in a completely different set of booklets that are exclusively dedicated to liturgical readings. However, we know, actually, that these were used liturgically because we've got rubrics that indicate the correspondence of the different sections to the sections corresponding in the liturgy. So, for example, as you see here, Lectio Secunda, so this would have been the second reading, and you get this up until Lectio Septima, so we can gather from this kind of rubrication that these are being used for liturgical practice. Now, what does this treatise actually contain? So, as I stated at the beginning, it is articulated against these 3 unbelievers, or 3 groups of unbelievers. So, however, only the very beginning of the treatise is actually directed to these 2 so-called heretics. who argued that Mary had not preserved her virginity in or postpartum. So essentially that in giving birth, she was no longer a virgin, or that she had had children afterwards. However, the vast majority of this treatise is actually directed contra judeos, on the question of her virginity, period. And it's really interesting, actually, because there are so many clear echoes between the liturgical texts, so all of the chant texts that are sung during the feast, and the treatise itself. So there are lots of resonances. So for example, this emphasis on Mary's constant or perpetual virginity, so ante, in, and postpartum. It's with reference to her virginity both before and after giving birth. So this is one of the themes that really dominates in this liturgy. Second of all, there are lots of shared biblical references, many of them referring to the virgin birth, so that seems quite instinctive. But another thing that's really interesting is this idea of the idea that Mary saves, so the soteriological role of Mary, not only by making salvation possible by having given birth to Christ, the Redeemer ultimately, but also her role as individual intercessor with penitent souls. So through prayer, you would be able to get you would be able to get salvation by prayer to her. So there's this idea that only through her can people come to Christ. She's really presented as a prerequisite of the true faith. And here's a really nice quote from the treatise itself to illustrate what I mean. They have found God through this virgin, those who were not able to find him through the observance of the law. Therefore, hasten with me to this virgin, that you may not hasten without her to hell. So Mary has a very clear role in this treatise of uniting people, of bringing them together in Christ, but also of marking out the saved from the damned, the saved being those who will follow her, the damned being those who do not. And this is really the message that permeates throughout the liturgy for this day. That's why the polemical aspect of the treatise isn't just auxiliary. It's really key to the main message that is being presented here about Mary and her relationship with Christians generally. And it is also actually very much present in a sermon that was included for the Mass of the day, which also uses a lot of the same biblical tropes and is also directed as a second person address to the Jews, as well as a heretic, but also to the Jews. So again, this polemical aspect is extremely important here. Now, I'm not claiming that Ildefonsus composed all of this as a nice unit. In fact, we don't have any evidence that he actually composed the chant text, and we know, or at least there's been some indication that he did not actually compose this sermon. However, we do know that the treatise was used in the liturgy very soon after its composition. So regardless of what Ildefonsus' role in this was, there was a sense in which all of this was built together. There's so many echoes between all of these different texts that there was some kind of cohesion between it in terms of its planning. Now, the Feast Day of Mary became one of the most important feast days in the entire Old Hispanic calendar. And we know this not just by the very length of the feast, or of the liturgy for the feast, but also because it's one of only a handful of feasts, together with Easter and Christmas, when even Jews were meant to not work. And this is stipulated in the laws of King Erwig, where it's stated that those days which shall be observed devoutly by the Jews are the following: the Feast of the Holy Virgin Mary, and then all these other feasts. But, I mean, not that many. So it's definitely one of the important ones. Now this law initially really sparked my interest because by observed devoutly, I thought, okay, what does this mean, actually? Could the Jews have been present in church for this Matins office to have heard this? Could the use of Ildefonsus' treatise have been meant to address them directly in this kind of setting? Now, this would certainly make the direct second person address that's employed in the treatise all the more resonant. And I kind of imagine Ildefonsus, or at least when I hear his words, I imagine it being said in the words of in the accent of a Southern Baptist preacher, because you'll hear what I mean, but I'm not even going to try to reproduce that. But I will read this to you. So, what do you say, O Jew? Why do you not believe that a virgin conceived without a husband? Why do you not believe that this particular virgin bore a son? Why do you not believe that she remained a virgin after the birth? Plainly you lie. You trick and you deceive. You accuse falsely. You attack falsely. You set out your argument falsely. You contend falsely. You argue falsely. You defend falsely. And thus, so you may learn from this truth the fullness of the whole truth, we assert. Consider, contemplate, see, understand, weigh carefully, notice, pay heed, know, savor, learn, recognize that this same one is God from God, in the truth of his own nature, who was made a man from a virgin. It's kind of repetitive like this. It really goes on for ages. So the use of the liturgy for proselytizing amongst the Jews would not have been entirely novel at this point, actually. And Severus of Minorca's account of the conversion of the Jews of Minorca in 418 attributes a considerable role to the liturgy in their conversion. So he describes a kind of multi-sensory assault through the singing of hymns and psalms, and also interpolated with prayer. However, the caveat is that legal historians have struggled with this law. Because what is meant by Jews in this case? How can we understand these as Jews when several decrees earlier, actually Erwig stipulated the mass conversion of the Jews in his entire kingdom, and those who did not convert should be expelled? So, what do we even understand when they're talking about Jews in these laws? Do we actually mean that these recently converted Jews, or converted, I should say baptized, these recently baptized Jews? So if it's not intended for Jews, practicing Jews, in the intention of bringing them to the Christian faith, actually, I still think that this issue of conversion provides a very interesting framework in which to explore the Marian liturgy, as uniting a population that would have included Christians and potentially these recently baptized Jews. And it's to this context of forcible conversion in the 7th century that I'm now going to turn. So, 589 marked a very important date. It was the conversion of King Recared, the first Visigothic king to have converted from Arianism after the conquest and occupation of Iberia by the Visigothic tribes. And what I mean by conversion in this sense is he adopted formally the Nicene Orthodox Christianity together with his Visigothic aristocracy, the religion essentially of the native population, the native Hispano-Romans of the population that he was conquering. Now, the period following this conversion saw an ideological push for the unification of the kingdom under the banner of Christian orthodoxy, with the king as protector and promoter of the faith as part of his political remit. So there was a very close alliance between the regum and the fides, essentially, of these two spheres. Now, 616, which is the date that I found to be the most recently argued date for this, marked a particularly ambitious attempt by King Sisebut at religious uniformity, and that was an attempt at converting the Jews. Something that was repeated, as Jessie mentioned earlier today in her paper, that was repeated at intervals over the course of the century by various different Visigothic rulers. Now, although the methods by which this conversion was achieved were certainly disputed, and ecclesiastical leaders were very much opposed to the use of force in this case, nevertheless, the presence of forcible converts or forcibly baptized Jews caused considerable concern. At least that's what we see emerging again and again from these legal sources. To keep them from apostatizing, to keep them from returning to their former Jewish practice. If, again, we are to believe the legal sources. So, for example, the fourth canon, or in the Fourth Council of Toledo, which is a text that Jessie quoted earlier this morning, I'll just remind you, those who were formerly coerced to Christianity, well, it is necessary for them to try and maintain the faith that they received, even if it was through force or necessity. Okay, so once baptized, always a Christian, essentially, in their thinking. Now, of course, this caused issues or problems. How do we deal with this situation? Well, one way of tackling the issue was to force all baptized Jews to swear an oath of faith, as this one, which appears among the councils of the Sixth Council of Toledo in 638. So among various other things, including the Trinity and other issues, they're supposed to say, "And we believe in the Son of God the Father, who was received flesh in the last days from Mary, the Eternal Virgin, with the cooperation of the Holy Ghost," etc., etc. Now, actually what I found really interesting about this is that it deviates from the Nicene Creed. How? By claiming Mary as the eternal virgin, which does not appear in the Nicene Creed. So it's interesting that already in 638, we see an interest in this characteristic of Mary as the perpetual eternal virgin. So I wonder whether that didn't influence later developments. Now, another way in which they tried to address this issue of recently baptized Jews was to order these recently baptized Jews to honor the main feast days by gathering publicly with priests. And this is a particularly interesting law. So in the Ninth Council of Toledo, or canon of the council, in the Ninth Council of Toledo in 655, it's stipulated that we order that baptized Jews, wherever they would live at other times, shall celebrate the major New Testament feasts, which were subsequently consecrated in cities and in public gatherings together with God's supreme priests. And it goes on a little bit from what I've quoted, in order that their way of life and faith should be approved by the bishop and safeguarded by the truth. Now, as you'll note from the date, this precedes the establishment of the Marian feast day by 1 year, but I'm going to assume, given the nature of this feast day and how important it was, that it would have been included amongst these those that these baptized Jews would have been expected to attend. What I think is so interesting and important about this is that they don't leave it up to the Jews themselves or these baptized Jews to just go out and do this. They have to do it in public with priests observing. So there is a very important aspect in which practice is being, or at least the law seems to suggest this, that practice needs to be observed, to be controlled, essentially. Now, one of the things that might have happened in this kind of gathering, actually, is the fact that certain texts would have been read to them, including, if we take the laws of King Erwig again from 681, their own errors. That is to say, bishops shall give to all Jews a copy of this book, that means the law code itself, which has been published for the purpose of correcting their errors, which is ordinarily read to them publicly in church. So there does seem to be some kind of tradition of reading texts publicly to Jews in order to these baptized Jews to keep them from apostatizing. Now this leaves us with a very intriguing idea, that Ildefonsus's treatise, incorporated into the liturgy, would have been read out in the presence of baptized Jews with a similar aim as these law codes. That is to say, to remind them of their errors that they were leaving behind, and to mark a clear distinction between their previous faith and their new one. Not just through the content of the liturgy itself, but also by the very fact of bringing them together with the Christian community for the performance of the ritual. So this isn't just about telling Jews what they're meant to believe, actually. In fact, I don't know that the pedagogical, there's a pedagogical aim here at all, actually. It's about integrating them into the community that was bound together by devotion to Mary and explicitly, polemically divided from Judaism. Now, there are a number of problems that you may have already had sort of running around in your minds while I've been talking, very pragmatic questions, actually, that are raised by this thesis, which I'll try to address before summing up. So, first of all, time of day. Matins is the night office in cathedrals, parish churches, and monasteries. Now, it seems kind of crazy that the entire population would have attended a 6+ hour service in the middle of the night. However, other major feast days also had vigils. So Christmas has a vigil, Easter has a vigil, the Feast of St. Martin, which is a particularly important saint in Visigothic Spain, also has a vigil. They have long readings, not as long as this one, that's for sure. The readings appear in the same manuscript as the ones for Mary. So, although we have no actual stipulations that people are supposed to be attending this kind of vigil, I don't think it's necessarily a stretch. Oh, we do know that people were attending the Easter Vigil, so that's the precedent. So I don't think it's necessarily a complete stretch to think that on very special days of the year, people would have attended church services, even in the middle of the night. Now, so that's a question mark. The second one, language. So all of these texts are in Latin, obviously. We might think that by the 7th century, there was a wide enough gap between the church Latin of the learned clerics and the vernacular. But actually, recent studies have suggested that the way in which this Latin would have been pronounced meant it would have been entirely intelligible to the population. So the language had not evolved that much that quickly. So it's also a question mark if we're to believe some of the linguistic analyses that have recently emerged. Architecture. This is another possible obstacle to access to this liturgy. Why? Because churches had multiple levels of separation between the congregation and the officiants. So the choir, which would have been singing, so I'm just going to point out, in this part there was probably a choir screen here of some kind, and this is the sanctuary where the officiant would have been. There was probably some kind of separation here. Just to give you an example from a contemporary manuscript, for example, these curtains, which would have separated the altar from the congregation, or from the choir, and then an additional separation from the congregation. So would people have even heard anything, actually, and what would they have heard? Well, this poses a problem, except that, if we're to believe Isidore of Seville, who was a contemporary of Ildefonsus of Toledo, died in 636, very important bishop, wrote in his study, or in his commentary on the ecclesiastical offices, that readings should be pronounced so as to be understood, meaning that they may have been read out from a pulpit of some kind, or at least with a loud enough voice that the lay congregation would have heard. So there's an obvious identification that people should be hearing and understanding the readings. Now, so that's a question mark again. So all of this suggests that people would have both heard and understood Ildefonsus's treatise as it was read out in the office of matins, making it certainly possible that it was integrated into the liturgy, at least with the intention of reminding baptized Jews of the folly of Judaism and that the path to salvation was Mary. You're all waiting for the concession. Now, this is because I'm very aware that recent scholarship has been turning away from the idea that polemical literature was produced, and not just in Visigothic Iberia, for the purpose of engaging directly with Jews. So, with specific reference to Visigothic Iberia, Wolfram Drews, Jamie Wood, Rachel Stocking, amongst many others, have all indicated that the polemical writings of Isidore of Seville, for example, were part of a much wider ideological stance that involved asserting orthodoxy versus the very recent memory of heterodoxy, namely the Visigoths' Arianism. So just to take a quote from Drews, anti-Jewish argument serves only to construct and endorse Catholic self-perception. So essentially, you don't really need the presence of Jews for this to be happening. Judaism is taken really as a counterpoint to proper Orthodox Christianity. Isidore's political aim was obviously unification. He stipulates this again and again in belief and in practice, and he casts Visigothic leaders as princes of Christ responsible for the spiritual well-being of all their subjects, meaning the need to unify everyone under a Christian banner. So he's involved in the kind of creation of a national mythology of orthodoxy, so to speak. Now, this ideology of uniformity could have included this anti-Jewish legislation, further hammering home the Christian character of the kingdom. So in fact, it's not necessary that these legal texts reflect a reality of Jewish conversions, merely an ideal of unity. And this is something that's emerging in the legal scholarship as well. So it's certainly possible that this new office of Mary played into this. It very obviously would have, because its underlying ideological position is an ideal of communal unification behind Mary as a figurehead of Christian orthodoxy. And I think this shows that liturgy can very much be an expression of an ideological position, actually. So Mary is being proclaimed all the time as a gateway to Christianity, a source of individual and universal salvation, and also she polices the borders of orthodoxy by marking out Christian territory from everything that lies outside of it. And there's really no need for Jews to even be present for this narrative to function. So, while I think that this is certainly the case to some degree, I think we can also, if we start to explore some of these legal sources, perhaps stop being quite so hesitant and think at least that there was a possibility the office could have additionally been considered by those designing it, a useful way to address recent converts and the risks of apostasy among them, because these are the very same individuals who are drafting the legal text, who are drafting the legislation. If anything, I want to, with this paper, make a plea for the liturgy as a potentially important element and place for dynamics of conversion. Because the concern was very much, just as much, if not more so, about practice as it was about belief, actually. And this liturgy certainly encompassed both aspects. It brought together a community and ritually reaffirmed their belief through its performance. Thank you.
Lively and thought-provoking presentation. I hope it will not be a scandalous breach of the rules of academic liturgy if I insert a little comment. Giles Constable article about Latin instead of vernacular in preaching that made it all the more appealing to the masses. You don't have to understand the sermon to, feel it's an important occasion and be drawn to its performance. Okay, our last speaker for this evening is Asya Bereznyak, and she's almost a PhD, right? At the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Her doctoral thesis, Missionary Cultures and Patterns of Conversion and Christianization in the Christian East and West between 750 and 1100, written under the supervision of Professor Esther Cohen, Alexander Kulik, aims to provide a new approach to the study of forced Christianization processes in early medieval Europe, and she's just waiting to be certified. She's already published several articles on the topic, and I'd also mention that Asya is a member of the Center for the Study of Conversion and intra-faith relations, right? Okay. Please, we're calling on to wrap up this very interesting session. Thank you.
Well, I have good news and better news. The good news is that I don't have a job. The better news, I'll be brief. Okay, but first I would really like to thank our speaker for these fascinating contributions to the study of conversion. I'm sure that the fascinating details and the list of all three lectures will be discussed during Q&A, and I aim to leave a lot of time for Q&A. So, but I still think that our speakers have raised some very important methodological and conceptual issues, and would therefore like to use my time to address them. These issues may exceed the immediate scope of this session, but they're important, I think, to all of us dealing with conversion. Several issues come to mind when we think of the delicate balance of considerations responsible for the ruler's decision to convert the other, especially the ultimate other, the Jews, in their kingdoms. As was shown during the first two presentations, the motivations to convert Jews in Europe were hardly limited to the realm of devotional and theological. Both political and financial considerations played a pivotal role in the decision to convert or refrain from conversion. Moreover, such consideration, as was so well shown by Professor Tolan and Dr. Elliott, had, of course, a profound impact on the success of missionary efforts and implications for the immediate situation of the converts. But there are several broader issues at play here. First, as has been pointed out by both Dr. Elliott and Professor Tolan, we should consider the ruler's ever-present need to balance the practical and religious considerations when deciding to dedicate means and efforts to convert. Of course, when we talk about religious motivations, we might want to distinguish between actual devotion of a given ruler, insofar as it can be at all determined, and his desire to present himself as such. This balance, I would point out, is not limited to the time and space with which we were concerned today. I would imagine that any and all of us, really, concerned with the role of the ruler in missions can benefit from considering factors besides zeal and devotion when examining possible motivations to evangelize or refrain from converting others, and in particular, the often neglected financial considerations. Moreover, we are often misled not only by primary sources, but also by recent historiography, and come to equate missionary rhetoric with actual desire to convert. Missionary rhetoric, of course, can be accounted for by the need to present the ruler as a good Christian monarch, devoted to his role as such. However, we must remember that for a variety of reasons, this rhetoric doesn't always translate into actual missionary activity, or if it does, it often lacks the full force of rulers' financial, military, and political support. This too, I believe, is applicable to much of our research. And I find that long before the kings of Spain, France, and England had to consider how to approach and support the conversion of Jews, the Byzantine emperor was already fooling his contemporaries and modern historians by adopting a stance of a benevolent supporter of missions, while at the same time allowing missions to take place only as the very last diplomatic resort. During approximately the same time in Western Europe, missionary activity may appear to be far freer and extensive, but in fact was often directed to serve the needs and wishes of the Frankish rulers. Needless to say, the success of missions, both in earlier and later period, both in Eastern and Western Europe, had much to do with the level of support extended by monarchs, and that often depended on rather unholy considerations. This brings me to another point, the often precarious balance between the desire to assimilate the other and the need, be it a theological, explicit or implicit need, to preserve the other. This need to maintain the other as such could be due to a variety of sociological and theological reasons, but should always be considered. As we have seen today, often practical financial reasons led to certain missionary policies. In other cases, other concerns were pivotal, such as the need to preserve cultural supremacy by doling out Christianity only in extreme cases, or on the contrary, when the need to Christianize was merely an aspect of an expansionist endeavor. Is it just me or the mic is really off?
It's not that mic.
Because I can really... I think I could just put without the microphone. No. You sure? Okay. But whatever the reasons were to refrain from all-out missionary endeavors, we should keep in mind that it was often more practical to refrain from converting to non-Christians, although such practical considerations were rarely openly discussed and admitted. It therefore falls to us to account for such mundane but crucial considerations. The need to unearth concealed motivations and differentiate between propaganda and actual intentions and deeds is intricate enough, but Dr. Ihnat's lecture serves to remind us of additional challenges. The question that often plagues us, especially those of us dealing with earlier periods, is the ability, or more often the inability, to deduce from polemic, liturgical, or derogatory sources about the actual presence of the other. This, I think, is not limited to Jews, but is in fact a major problem also when we encounter descriptions of pagans and heretics. While a Christian writer, who is, more often than not, a man of cloth, is seemingly obsessed with all those pagan, heretic, or Jewish others, when should we believe him? Did they even exist in his immediate environment, or did he merely choose to center his narrative on what he considered to be the greatest antithesis or threat to Christianity? Did the others merely serve as a literary device for writers against which they defend their own Christian identity? Can we believe the descriptions of those authors? Can we really say that the apparent focus, bordering on obsession, on Jews, pagans, and heretics directly correlates with the number of actual Jews, heretics, and pagans in that Christian environment? It may seem that today's historiography is more sophisticated than that, but it does not mean we already have all the answers. It is all too easy to dismiss all such accounts as literary tropes. Surely, we must devise better methods to ascertain whether and how many such others existed in our writers' environments. Dr. Ihnat's paper is a fascinating contribution to this effort, one that reminds us that we should approach these complex questions from multiple angles and consider all possible evidence in an effort to ascertain the actual purpose and possible intent and use of our sources. Personally, I was particularly interested in the idea brought up in both Professor Tolan's and Dr. Ihnat's papers, the notion of forcing Jews, Muslims, and forced converts to listen to preachers in order to encourage them to convert. The idea that exposure to Christian ideas might be enough to induce conversion, or maybe preserve conversion, is both old and new, insofar as in comparison to earlier periods, we find that this is both a continuation of older trends and a deviation from them. If in earlier periods, such as that Dr. Ihnat discussed, the focus might not have been only on contents and verbal messages only, but also on the overall sensory experience, as happens during liturgies, in later Middle Ages, it seems that the verbal message was considered to be, if not exclusive, then at least more central to the missionary efforts. If we look beyond the scopes of today's session, we'll see that missionary means and methods varied greatly, not only as times changed, but also according to the cultural background of missionaries. We cannot say that all early medieval missionaries stressed presentation over contents, just as we cannot accept that later medieval missionaries were more concerned with contents of their Christian message. However, I do find it interesting that while we often find an overwhelming stress on modification of behavior as the main means of conversion among pagans in earlier Middle Ages, the approach to the conversion of Jews seems to have been quite different, both in Byzantine Spain and among later rulers. The shifts in these missionary approaches, the developments in the use of legislation, and the potential employment of Christian liturgy for the purpose of conversion all seem worthy of further exploration, and I am looking forward to hearing and reading more on these matters. I would like to thank our speakers again for bringing up these important issues, and especially for highlighting the ambivalence inherent to royal policies toward the Jews, and the myriad of considerations we should keep in mind when examining sources concerned with conversion. Thank you.
Enthusiasts. Oh dear, we won't be done until 8 probably. Please.
First of all, this was a wonderful, wonderful panel. I enjoyed all 3 papers. Just two very brief questions or comments for Kati and for Jessica. Kati, I'm curious why you shied away at one point from the pedagogical element of the liturgy, especially after having quoted that very hortatory line. You set out your argument so falsely, may you learn from this. And it strikes me as it'd be hard to sort of formulate a more pedagogical dimension to that. So I'd be curious what you thought about that. And then Jessica, I'm curious why you assume or seem to be assuming that the converts are fully converts in France. And or to put this a little bit more pointedly, have you considered, I suppose, the fact that there are so many converts successfully aspiring to professional careerism in France as a possible concealment of their true faith? And I go back to something that Kati did a couple of times where she said converted and then sort of went back and said baptized. And that brings up really what's, I think, a very big issue here. So, I don't know, have you considered that element? In other words, not taking at face value the fact that they are calling themselves or being called converts, but the fact that they're having so much success as being possibly a guise of some sort.
Maybe we should take 3 questions in a row.
Up to you. Up to you.
Or would you rather answer them in a Okay, let's begin like this and see how it goes.
Okay, so on the matter of pedagogy,
maybe step up or...
Okay, so one counter argument to my argument would have been obviously that there's a lot of exegetical material in this treatise and in the liturgy. That's maybe where there would have been a kind of teaching element. Okay, this is the proper interpretation of Scripture. This is how it applies to Mary. The reason why I would hesitate to say that the whole liturgy has an explicitly pedagogical purpose is, first of all, because Isidore is very skeptical about the ability to convince Jews even by reason. I think his main emphasis is, okay, well, we can talk to them about it, but actually they're going to convert at the end of time anyway. So that's really the concern there. So I don't know, actually, whether there was a sense in which, well, by talking to them, and especially by haranguing them in this way, I think that's the other thing. When you read the sort of extended abuse that Jews are receiving in this liturgy, you think, I mean, how could this have convinced, or how could this have been meant to teach?
It doesn't have to be pedagogy for the Jews.
Yeah. Oh, I see.
Pedagogy for the Christians.
Right. Yes. Okay, I take your point. Yeah.
Thanks for your question, Alex. If I understand correctly, you're asking about whether whether I believed them to be sort of true and like, committed Christians, which I think is a great question, and I certainly wouldn't purport to that we can use these sources to determine their level of religious belief. But I would suggest that it is possible to use these sources to try to access what their Christian neighbors appear to perceive as their level of conversion or belief. But I think especially in light of the economic benefits to conversion, and especially the financial, the extreme disincentives to remaining Jewish, I certainly wouldn't suggest that this group of converts were all faithful Christians and completely committed to Christianity in any. That's not an argument I would make with these sources.
But as you've said elsewhere, those converts, the next generation, you don't even know that they're descendants of converts often.
Yes, and thank you for bringing that up. I guess that's another point that I would add here, and actually where I thought your question was going at first about how I can tell that these are converts. And whether they are kind of first-generation converts or the descendants of converts. And with these sources, especially with the tax records, what you find is that an individual is often identified as a convert only once. So they might be identified as Pierre le Convert in 1 year, and then Pierre de Pontoise in the next, and then Pierre de Pontoise, the taverner, in the third. And it's only by sort of tracing through all of those years that you can figure out that finally at the end, Pierre le Convert is from de Pontoise. And I think that if it were being inherited as a name, it would be used more consistently rather than as a way to describe someone.
Just two short informational questions. So John, when you were quoting James, when you were discussing James, you kept on saying Jews and Muslims. And I think I heard in the direct quote you said Jews and pagans. So I was wondering about that. And for Jessica, you mentioned about Jews called Louis because of the patronage. Bill Jordan makes an issue in his book about the fact that Louis was restricted to as a royal name, which is why when Yechiel of Paris says lots of kids are named Louis, that maybe he was being less than serious. I was curious about that.
Yeah, on the first point, in medieval Latin, Muslims are referred to usually as Saraceni, but often as Pagani. And this allows, in canon law, a lot of the earlier legislation involving pagans to then be brought up and applied to Muslims.
How does that fit into the question about which is closer to Christianity, Jews or Muslims?
Well, that's an interesting question. In some ways, I mean, Peter the Venerable in his book, in his treatise against Islam, says, well, should we consider them as Gentiles, or we consider them as heretics? I don't know if that particularly, I mean, it doesn't come into the equation. That isn't weighed in to decide whether they're closer, which is closer to Christianity. But clearly they're seen as, in some cases, they're seen as pagans who are sort of, Gentiles outside of the equation. Sometimes they're seen as Christians who've been taken away into heresy. If you look in Dante, he puts Muhammad in the circle of the schismatics in hell because he split off part of Christianity from the true church. So you see both of these. They aren't usually referred to as heretics in the text, and particularly not in the legal text. They're referred to most often as Saraceni, but also as Pagani. I think Jessica wanted to respond as well.
Just quickly, and it's true that it's true that converts tend to be named after their patron, or are often named after their patron, and I think that I wouldn't dispute Jordan's point about the mid-13th century, especially since the types of sources that I'm using don't really survive for that period. By the end of the 13th century, we see quite a few individuals with royal names, like with the name Philippe in the tax records, and I I certainly can't imagine that they're princes or converts running around Paris all with that name. So I think we do see these names sort of in wider use by that point.
I think you want to add something? Yeah.
No, I just wanted to remark on the pagans. Usually it is either the earlier sources that refer to Muslims as pagans before the 7th century, before people knew more about Islam, or literary sources, like the Song of Roland, for example, and sources like this, and even Crusader sources that sometimes refer to the Muslims as pagans. Although they must have known better, but still they refer to them as pagans. But from the 13th century onwards, it's becoming rare.
But you still find it in legal sources in Latin, Pagani.
You find it,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it's becoming rare.
Yeah.
Please.
One question for Jessica. I would like to ask you whether, according to your sources, the issue of conversion was related to the successive expulsions and readmissions of the Jews of France.
Well, generally, generally, at least in France, the idea that expulsion would lead to conversion is seen as not, that it wasn't incredibly successful, it wasn't an incredibly effective sort of way of bringing about conversion. There are, we do see a couple instances in 1307 and 1310, shortly after the expulsion, cases of lapsed converts in Paris. So I think it's likely that due to the timing, those might be individuals who had converted to avoid the expulsion. I think in general, I don't think the evidence is there yet to suggest that there were large groups of converts specifically because of the expulsion. But I do think that the expulsions could have played an important role in Christian perceptions of converts and sort of the change in how Christians are thinking about converts and their concerns and fears about converted Jews.
First of all, thank you all for a fascinating panel. I have two questions. One is for Kati and one is for John. For John, the question is whether the royal attitude towards Jews and the role of the Domus Conversorum, does it change anyway or is affected by, for instance, events like the Baronial Revolt against Henry III, which is in many ways a cataclysmic event to his royal status, where entire sectors of English society kind of part from him, and there are segments of England that are conquered for a very long while, and of course Jews are targeted during that rebellion, and the status of Jews is something of a pivotal importance in that revolt. And the question for Kati, I was fascinated by your talk, and what I'm, as you probably know, some of the people in this room wrote about the issues of the Virgin Mary and the role of the Virgin Mary as a kind of the extended arm of Christianity towards Judaism. Chaim wrote about it, Ora wrote about it. What I was wondering is whether some of this material surfaces later on, and you were referring to manuscripts from the 10th century. Does any of this seep beyond the Iberian Peninsula to Northern Europe, or is this a very typical Iberian phenomenon?
Well, that's a very good question. This is what you're getting at is the main reason I'm interested in writing a book about this tough subject, because the implication of, why is it that when there are revolts against the power of Henry III, what do? You go kill a bunch of Jews. Because the Jews are so closely associated with royal power, and because there are, we have various texts. I mean, what's happening is that Jews are the only ones that can lend money at interest. They're lending out money. The accounts of this are closely kept in these archives, these chests that royal officials have access to. And so when the king needs money, what he does, he said, well, how much money have these Jews got out? Let's tax them based not on what they actually have, but on the wealth they've put out in loans. So that then the Jews, in order to have money to pay the king, what do they have to do? They have to sell their debts cheap to people, often aristocrats, sometimes monasteries, in some cases the queen, whose interest is not in making just the interest from those loans, but in actually seizing the land. So this is a big complaint, and who's blamed for this whole system, of course, it's the Jews who are blamed, who are suffer attacks. Now, what specific impact that might have had on the Domus Conversorium, I don't know. That's a good question. I haven't seen, of course, London, the London Jewry is attacked in 1264. Many Jews are killed. Some manage to take refuge in the Tower of London. And then we have various documents issued by Henry III in the following years reaffirming the Jews' possessions of certain lands, houses, letting them sort of try to build back up their records that were destroyed so they can then start collecting their debts again. But I have, so far I've seen no specific reference to what the effect of that violence may have been on the Domus Conversorum.
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's something I want to look into more, but I can give you a three-part answer because this whole sort of phenomenon, I guess, travels in three ways. So first of all, the treatise itself. The treatise definitely does travel. There's interest in it specifically at Cluny, actually. The abbot of 10th century abbot of Cluny, Odo, gets really interested in this. He gets a copy sent to him from Iberia, and from there it sort of goes off into the rest of Europe. Secondly, the liturgy, more unusually. So in Iberia itself, there was a complete switch over at the end of the 11th century from an old Hispanic form of liturgy into the Roman Rite. So pretty much the entire old Hispanic office, the way we know it, pretty much disappears, except for this Marian feast. Really intriguingly, I found it in a 13th century manuscript with Roman chant texts, but the same treatise. And this is something I really want to chase up because I got really excited when I found that. Second way that the liturgy travels, weirdly enough, the reason why I originally became interested in this is because I found this feast popping up in East Anglia in the 12th century. So the abbot of Bury St. Edmunds, Anselm, so from in the 1120s, adopts this feast day. And there is clear interest in the Iberian traditions of Marian devotion. And I think this sort of kickstarts, or at least is one of the moments in which we see the kickstart of this sort of rise of popular devotion to the Virgin. And the third way in which this travels is through a miracle story which was attributed to Ildefonsus. He was attributed with a miracle in which he writes this treatise, he presents it to the Virgin, she appears to him with a pallium, and only he can wear it. So such that when he dies and his successor tries to put it on, he immediately dies. And this story became really popular and became an absolute fixture in all of these massive miracle collections that we get in the later medieval tradition. Oftentimes it's the first one in the entire collection. So clearly there's a knowledge of this, there's a desire for this kind of Iberian tradition.
Thank you for the papers and for the comment. One of the things that Asya brought up was the impact of royal ambivalence and the way that this imparts a particular dynamic to different situations. So I wanted to ask about royal ambivalence and what you see, and whether or not it's witting or unwitting. So is it just something we see in hindsight, or would monarchs and their advisors have been aware of contradictory policies? Does ambivalence result from historical contingency? Does it reflect the evolution of a ruler's thinking and attitudes towards the subject? Or does it reflect sort of monarchs' constituencies and trying to please different groups in particular ways, resulting in this ambivalence? Because I think it was a key part of the papers, and so I wanted to think about, can we take this idea of ambivalence and historicize it a bit?
I can start because I'm quite new to the field of Visigothic Iberia, I have to admit, and there are people in this room who are much more experienced in this, but there's definitely something to be said for that, because this period sees the rapid succession of multiple rulers, and each of them seem to switch between different approaches to policies towards the Jews, and that might be a reflection of, well, I want to distinguish myself from my successor who I murdered, kind of thing. So, or predecessor, sorry. So I think that there's definitely a need to historicize in just the way that you're specifying.
Yeah, I mean, this comes back to the question that came up yesterday of, how to assess motivation, and we talked about it with converts. What's true conversion from not, and I have enough trouble understanding why I do things. How can I judge what some king who's been dead since the 13th century, what his motivations were based on the fragmentary documentation? But clearly, there's, as I think the three papers have made clear in different ways, there are forces pushing in different directions. So there are good reasons for each of these policies that may, in some cases, be in contrast with each other. And probably some of these kings are aware of their own contradictions, just as we are sometimes in our more lucid moments aware of our own contradictions.
I would agree, and I would just add, I think that sort of ambivalence is kind of inherent in this sort of issue, and I think that you've really highlighted a really important point about being really clear about what our sources can and can't tell us, and just whether they can, show us how converts or baptized Jews are really feeling about what's happened to them, or whether they show us something completely different, whether they show us what a ruler is thinking, or just sort of what's happening.
Yeah, Jessica, I have a question, of course, because our lectures are a bit touching each other. You mentioned a lot of professions for the converts. So, two questions. Did you find these professions also for Jews? If not, how could it be that in such a short time people learned it? Could it be that this financial support people, converts, get is a sort of transition support for apprenticeship or for education or for whatever? So could this have you any hint? And could you trace back certain people to their existence as Jews? So how do you know when this changed, or how long they are converts then? Or
so to answer the last question first, unfortunately, no, absolutely not. There's no evidence of that in the sources, which is really unfortunate. And that's sort of a kind of long-term goal with this project. I'd love to eventually be able to discover that type of evidence for these people, but thus far the sources just don't have that kind of thing. In terms of professions, some of the professions that these converts practice are practiced by Jews in Paris, and some of them are practiced by Jews elsewhere in Europe, especially in the Mediterranean, which I think is one of the really interesting things about the evidence in the tax records, that it can show ways in which things that other historians have shown for Jews in the Mediterranean might possibly extend in certain circumstances to northern France as well, such as the involvement of Jews in the textile industry, which recent historians have explored for the medieval and early modern Mediterranean. And then
the support, the gas perhaps, there are not much support, not many people get support, so perhaps it's a transition during their apprenticeship or during their learning a profession.
I think that would be, that would certainly be an interesting sort of use of it if that is the case. In terms, I haven't seen anything to suggest that, and some of the converts who receive that support receive it for their entire lives as they're employed by the court in other ways, such as Philippe Le Convert and his family. In terms of more anonymous converts, I'm not sure if there would be a way to explore that, but that's a very interesting idea, and I'll certainly keep thinking that over.
I'm trying to figure out how I could put it all together, but I can't. I probably have to go two different ways. I want to bring up the issue of law again to John and to Kate. In England, there's something called quo warranto. The king is trying, succeeding actually, in getting everybody to come to his courts. And that was a prime reason for holding on to Jews. Because, you had a fight with a Jew, you had to go to the king's court. And now everybody's going to the king's court, and nobody has feudal power anymore. And this gives the king a great deal of power. The king can afford, this is a 13th century monarchy. This is not contemporary Israel, where we have no contradictions in our government and rulers. Okay? I don't like the word ambivalence. That's my problem. I like multivalent, if you wish. I have an attempt to do two things at once. I have the thought of Edward I saying to Archbishop Peckham, when Peckham says they're still lending, the king says, well, I tried. I mean, that's what he says, I tried. They're trying to do two things at once, three things at once, four things at once. And I don't think that they have to be mutually exclusive. And this would apply, Katie, I think in what I followed, and you know where I've written on both these subjects. In Visigothic Spain, I found it very important for the kings to unite Visigothic Spain under their own law, because they're not the majority. The Visigoths aren't the majority. They have to do something to get it together. Now, what you say makes great sense. It makes wonderful sense. I loved it. But I would see it alongside. I don't have to. It doesn't have to be exclusive. Because they finally changed the law code in order to try to get these Jews, baptized Jews and Christians, is how some of the laws say. They're just amazing. And so they're trying to do all this kind of thing together. So we can look at legal unity, we can look at multivalence. We don't have to put ourselves in straitjackets. To Jessica. You know what really bothers me? Not in your research, I'm in awe at your research and going into these archives and all these chicken scratches and putting things together. That's what it is. It was John Mundy, the late John Mundy used to refer to the notarial documents that way as chicken scratches. I can understand the massive conversion in Iberia. You know, it's this thing, well, everybody's doing it, let's do it. We know the conversion, we know the Crusades, we know there's force, semi-force, whatever, people afraid. What brings somebody, and this isn't really the question, what brings somebody in France where there is a lot of pressure and a lot of difficulty, of 150 people, I don't know how many Jews there were in France, probably a few thousand. Anybody have any idea on the number? What brings these people to convert? Is it economic reasons? I have difficulty. I believe when I read the Pope saying so-and-so converted, he's poor, she's poor, give them money. Maybe those people really believed something, and they knew what they were doing. But are these people really converts? Are they French? Maybe they came from the South, where they were forced to convert and moved up. Is what often converts are referred to as Judeus in the documentation. So are we really sure that we have converts here? There are a lot of questions about who we're following here in your documentation. It's terrific. I'm in awe of your ability to work and do this kind of thing. I just wonder where we really are and how we try to explain all of a sudden why 150 out of 10,000. If we're 5,000 out of 10,000, I have no problem. Well, what brings 150? They had a barogas, they got angry? Could be. Could be, it certainly could be, but you know, we have to try to somehow account for these people other than saying, well, they did it because they wanted lucrative professions, because why them and not the others? Okay, I spoke too long.
Maybe we don't have evidence for the others, but please.
Should we answer in order?
Go.
Well, I think in terms of, first of all, so my sources don't go back and forth between referring to people as converts or as Jews. So we don't see that sort of specifically here, although I understand that we see it elsewhere. I certainly think it's possible that some of these converts are people who were possibly forcibly converted or converted for a multitude of reasons elsewhere and ended up in northern France. Some of these converts are described as being from elsewhere in northern France. So it's likely that they started out in one of the smaller cities or smaller towns and migrated to Paris. I think it's also likely that a number of individuals, if they had converted for any of a number of reasons in sort of the Paris area or in the larger kingdom would have ended up in Paris, just in terms of how uncomfortable it might have been to remain where they had been, or painful, depending on sort of their reasons for converting. I certainly agree that it's crucial to try to get at the motivations for converting in a given situation. From these sources, I don't think it's possible to say that. I would be cautious about suggesting, and I don't mean to suggest that all Northern French converts converted for economic or financial benefit, but I think it's an important piece to sort of add to that picture and add to our understanding of the situation.
Yeah, if you want to, I said ambivalence, ambi means two ways, and you want to say multivalence, which in many ways, I can take that no problem. They have many, they're being pulled many different ways, not just two ways. To get back at what you asked Jessica and what we're talking about, the motivation of converts, and again, often we're dealing with documentation where you can't see that clearly, and sometimes, as you said, there's violence, and it seems very clear why. Why is there in some other societies a trickle rather than a big flood? I'm thinking of an example of a very different society. I'm thinking of Sicily. When Ibn Jubayr goes to Sicily and describes the Muslim communities in Sicily under the Norman kings, and describe them, how on the whole they're pretty well tolerated and so forth, but he says it's dangerous because you go to families and there's no discipline anymore because a father, if a son does something he shouldn't, and the father says, listen, come here, I'm going to show you. The son says, Dad, look out. If you slap me, I'm going to run to the church and ask for the priest to baptize me. And this is a kind of dynamic, and this you can imagine as a minority in a majority community. When there are family problems, when there are divisions between you and your neighbor, it can be tempting for someone, or you fall in love with a Christian girl or boy. There can be a lot of situations that will tempt individuals to move over.
I know it all sounds great, but I don't buy it.
What don't you buy?
I mean, all these situations.
Whoever supposed to tell us.
No, what I'm saying is
We'll continue over dinner, please.
I have basically nothing more to say. Yes, that's what I tried to conclude in my paper at the end by sort of drawing attention to that. And also, it's a very complex situation with distinctions between what's going on the ground and what's actually being written